Imagine walking deep beneath the earth where no light dares to reach, where time itself has frozen in terror. For nearly 8 decades, what lay hidden under the ruins of Berlin was whispered only in rumors, a bunker untouched since the fall of the Third Reich. But when a team of explorers finally forced open its rusted doors, they didn't just find relics of war. They found something far more disturbing. The discovery began as an accident, a misstep during a routine urban excavation meant to reinforce an aging section of Berlin's underground transit system. The workers had been drilling through layers of compacted earth and shattered concrete when the drill head struck something hollow, a deep metallic clang that echoed unnaturally in the narrow shaft. At first, they assumed it was a forgotten drainage pipe, maybe an old wartime storage area, but the sound that followed wasn't metallic. It was a breath of air, stale and cold, escaping from a chamber that hadn't been disturbed in almost 8 decades. Word spread quickly, and by nightfall, the site had been cordoned off, guarded by men in uniforms who refused to answer questions. A few days later, a special team of historians and structural archaeologists were brought in under strict confidentiality agreements, the kind signed when governments wish to erase curiosity. They descended into the darkness with high-powered lamps, ground-penetrating scanners and cameras, each step sinking them deeper into a pocket of history that time had chosen to forget. The deeper they dug, the more they realized this wasn't part of any known map of Berlin's wartime tunnels. The walls were reinforced with thick concrete, bearing the faint outline of the Reich eagle, its wings chipped and faded but unmistakable. The architecture matched no civilian design. This was built to last through fire, bombs, and siege. When the scanners began to reveal the faint outline of doorways and corridors branching off in multiple directions, the air around the team grew charged with something between dread and fascination. They had stumbled upon a hidden structure beneath one of the most documented cities on Earth, a place deliberately erased from every archive. As the entrance was finally widened, they found a rusted steel door sealed from the inside. Its hinges creaked under the weight of time, the sound echoing like a scream in the narrow chamber. When it finally gave way, a wave of air rolled out, thick, stale, heavy with the scent of mold and metal decay. The first flashlight beams cut through the blackness and revealed a corridor leading downward, the walls lined with corroded pipes and wiring still sheathed in the fabric wrappings typical of 1940s electrical insulation. The deeper they went, the temperature dropped, and the faint hum of the city above disappeared completely. They reached a heavy blast door next, its frame engraved with a serial number unlike anything catalogued in wartime blueprints. The historian leading the team, a woman named Dr. Maren Vogt, realized almost immediately that this was no ordinary shelter. The reinforced ceiling, the oxygen regulators, and the remnants of communication cables suggested a command post, but the secrecy of its location implied something much more personal. The bunker hadn't been designed for the military at large. It had been built for someone specific, someone who demanded absolute isolation. The implication sent a chill through the group, though none dared speak the name forming in their minds. Inside the first chamber, they found remnants of furniture, rotting wood, metal cots, a table covered in papers turned to dust. The flashlight beams caught faded swastikas on the walls, propaganda posters still clinging to the concrete, and a map of Europe pinned behind glass, its edges burned and brittle. But it wasn't the relics of war that unsettled them. It was the sense of preservation. Everything inside looked untouched, frozen exactly as it had been left, as though the people who once occupied the space had vanished mid-action. A half-empty teacup sat on a corner shelf. A typewriter rested beside yellowed pages filled with names and numbers. Even a coat hung neatly by the entrance, its fabric eaten away but still upright as if waiting for its owner to return. Deeper inside, the corridors branched off into smaller rooms. Some contained crates marked with the double lightning bolts of the SS, others with symbols none of them could immediately identify. There were documents sealed in airtight canisters, small vials of unknown substances, and photographs showing faces that had never been part of any official record. One of the explorers, a cameraman named Lucas, recorded everything despite repeated warnings from the officials above ground. His footage would later become the only surviving visual evidence of what they saw, as most of the materials were confiscated by authorities within hours of the find. What unsettled them most was the condition of the space. There were no signs of bomb damage or fire, no evidence of looting. It was as if the bunker had sealed itself off deliberately, preserving its contents and perhaps its secrets. Dust covered everything, yet the air was unnaturally dry, as though something had kept decay at bay. Instruments from the 1940s still sat on the tables, untouched. There were handwritten notes in German, listing coordinates, unfamiliar names, and strange phrases that seemed out of place for a wartime bunker, referring to the gate, the crossing, and the ascension. As they moved deeper, a pattern began to emerge in the structure itself. The walls were reinforced with alternating layers of lead and concrete, far thicker than necessary for protection against bombs. It was as if they were trying to contain something rather than shield from outside attack. Dr. Vogt began to suspect that the bunker was never meant to be an escape route or a command center at all. It was a vault, a tomb built not for safety, but for secrecy. By the time they reached the final chamber, nearly 200 meters below ground, the air felt electric, charged with something none of them could explain. Lucas's camera flickered as he panned the room, and the footage later revealed faint distortions, shadows that seemed to move without light, shapes that disappeared when approached. The chamber itself was circular, with walls lined in blackened steel and a single chair bolted to the floor in the center. On the wall behind it hung a flag bearing the Reich insignia, but beneath it was something else carved directly into the metal, a symbol none of them recognized, a spiral intersected by lines like rays of light or veins of energy. They had found something far more important than they expected, a place deliberately buried, wiped from existence, protected not just by concrete but by fear and secrecy that survived generations. The discovery was only the beginning, and as the echoes of their footsteps faded into the stillness, each member of the team understood that they had crossed a threshold that should never have been reopened. Inside the bunker, as the dust began to settle and the stale air thickened, the explorers' flashlights revealed an astonishing and chilling sight, the first glimpses of the artifacts. These were not the kind of relics typically found in war ruins or forgotten Nazi shelters. What lay before them seemed deliberately arranged, as though part of a display meant for unseen eyes. On the first metal table sat several rusted canisters labeled with cryptic German phrases that, when translated, hinted at preservation and continuation. Some of the containers had been sealed with wax and still bore the imprint of the Reich eagle pressed into the seal, a symbol so sharp and well preserved that it looked freshly stamped despite being nearly 80 years old. Around them were stacks of photographs, yellowed with time yet strangely clear, depicting not soldiers or battlefields, but rooms filled with robed figures standing around circular markings drawn on the floor. The images looked ritualistic, ceremonial, something between science and superstition, and their origin was a mystery none could explain. Dr. Vogt, the historian, carefully picked up a leather-bound folder found beside the photographs. The texture of the cover was rough, almost organic, and inside were sketches of strange machinery, coils, lenses, and human figures connected by cables. The notes, written in a precise, obsessive hand, detailed something referred to as Project Morgenlicht, or Project Morning Light. It described attempts to harness energy from beyond the threshold of matter, a concept that shouldn't have existed in the scientific vocabulary of 1945. Alongside the folder were half-burned notes in a different handwriting, written in frantic script, warning that the experiments were unstable and that the boundary screams when touched. The deeper they dug through the piles of documents, the clearer it became that this was not just a shelter, it was a place of research and possibly worship. In the far corner of the room sat several metal crates, stacked like coffins. One was pried open, revealing military uniforms folded with unnatural care, each bearing insignias that didn't match known divisions of the SS. There were symbols embroidered into the collars, intricate and alien, resembling interlocking spirals. Inside one of the crates lay small glass vials containing an amber-colored liquid, sealed and labeled with serial numbers. When one of the team members shone a light through them, faint shapes shimmered inside like drifting threads of smoke. They quickly resealed the crates, uneasy at the idea of disturbing whatever the substance was. The second chamber they entered was smaller but more personal. It resembled a study, complete with a desk, an oil lamp still upright, and a mirror leaning against the far wall. The mirror was peculiar, its surface almost completely blackened, reflecting only faint silhouettes. On the desk were several items that made the team's pulse quicken. A revolver with the initials AH etched on the handle, a cigarette case, and a notebook filled with dates and short entries written in tight, almost mechanical handwriting. Though they could not be certain, some of the dates corresponded to the final days of April 1945. The entries, however, spoke not of war or defeat, but of the awakening beneath the earth and the promise of rebirth. The pages ended abruptly, the last one smeared by something that looked too dark to be ink. Another wall was lined with display cases containing what appeared to be religious and occult relics, crosses inverted and modified, stones etched with runic inscriptions, and pages torn from ancient texts bound together with wire. None of these were officially recorded in any known Nazi archives. Among them was a parchment depicting an eye surrounded by concentric circles, with text in Latin describing Dominus Terrae, Lord of the Earth. The combination of mysticism, pseudoscience, and war iconography created an atmosphere of dreadful curiosity that suffocated the air. It felt as if they had stepped into the mind of something or someone who had blurred the line between faith and madness. Lucas, the cameraman, continued documenting every artifact. Though his footage often glitched at strange moments, his camera would distort the image whenever it lingered on certain objects for too long. The light would bend, colors would smear, and the sound would fracture into static bursts. At first they thought it was interference from the thick layers of metal and concrete surrounding them. But when the distortion repeated every time he pointed toward the mirror or the parchment, even the skeptics in the group grew silent. One of the archaeologists, Anton, discovered a side passage behind a false wall panel. It led into a narrow room lined with shelves holding jars filled with preserved biological samples. Tissues, eyes, small organs, all tagged with coded labels. The preservation fluid was still clear, and though impossible, some of the specimens appeared perfectly intact, their veins faintly visible beneath the glass. Dr. Vogt theorized that the bunker had some kind of primitive air filtration system that slowed decay, but another part of her, the part that had seen too much already, knew it was something else. On another table sat several wax cylinders used for audio recordings, along with a gramophone. When they carefully turned the crank and played one, the sound that emerged was faint but distinct, a man's voice, low and deliberate, speaking German in a calm, almost hypnotic tone. The words translated roughly to phrases like, "The door is not to be opened," "The threshold must remain sealed," and "The hour of ascension awaits the chosen." The voice broke into static halfway through, replaced by a noise that sounded like deep breathing or wind moving through a cavern. The team turned off the machine immediately, unsettled by the way the sound seemed to vibrate through the floor beneath them. The walls of the chamber told their own story. Scratches covered parts of the concrete, not random but patterned, as though someone had tried to etch messages using nails or tools. Some of the markings were in German, others in Latin, and one phrase appeared repeatedly across multiple rooms: "Sieh nicht hin," or "Do not look." It was written near the mirror, above the crates, and next to the sealed doorway that led further into the bunker. Every discovery deepened the unease, suggesting that those who had worked or lived here had experienced something beyond human understanding, something that forced them into silence or madness. The more they uncovered, the stronger the sense grew that these artifacts had not been abandoned, but left intentionally, preserved for someone or something to find at the right time. Every item, every symbol, every preserved scrap of writing seemed part of a larger design, as though the bunker itself was both archive and altar, a monument to a forgotten purpose that had never been meant to resurface. The deeper they ventured into the labyrinth of concrete and shadow, the more the team began to feel an invisible weight pressing against them, a pressure that grew heavier with every step. The air became colder, too cold for the sealed environment they were in, and their breath began to miss despite their equipment indicating no significant drop in temperature. The dim beams of their flashlights seemed to stretch unnaturally long, fading into blackness as though swallowed by something that resisted illumination. Even the sound of their footsteps began to change, echoing back not in rhythm with their pace, but with a lag, as if something else was walking behind them just slightly out of sync. At first, they dismissed it as the natural acoustics of underground chambers, but when Lucas replayed his recordings later, they would all hear the faint echo of additional steps following theirs long after they had stopped moving. It was during this descent that the first strange event occurred. While cataloguing the relics in one of the inner rooms, Anton dropped his flashlight. When he bent to pick it up, he froze mid-motion. He swore that in the reflection of the cracked mirror across the room, he saw someone standing behind him, a tall figure in a dark uniform with a face completely obscured by shadow. He spun around instantly, but there was nothing there, just the silence and the faint dripping of water somewhere far away. The others dismissed it as fatigue, nerves, or the tricks of light and confinement, but from that point on, none of them moved alone. Even the calm, logical voice of Dr. Vogt trembled as she instructed everyone to stay in groups of 2 or more. Hours passed in a strange rhythm. The deeper levels seemed to consume the sense of time itself. No one could tell how long they had been down there, and their watches began to malfunction one by one, hands freezing at different moments. Lucas's camera continued to flicker, and on several recordings, strange distortions appeared that weren't visible in real life. Blurred outlines of what looked like human figures standing at the edges of the light. The interference grew stronger near certain walls, especially those bearing strange carvings and symbols. The energy meters brought to detect residual electromagnetic fields began spiking wildly, producing readings far beyond anything natural. At first, the group rationalized everything as byproducts of decaying wiring and underground interference, but as they approached the farthest chamber, even their logic began to crack. The walls started showing condensation despite the cold dryness of the air, as though something within them breathed. The faint hum they had heard earlier grew stronger, now rhythmic, pulsing like the slow heartbeat of the earth itself. It reverberated through the concrete, deep and resonant, and seemed to respond to their movements. One of the technicians, pale and sweating, suggested it was the sound of old ventilation systems activating under pressure, but the power cables they traced were long dead. When they reached the threshold of the final passageway, Lucas's camera battery died abruptly, though it had been freshly charged. Dr. Vogt instructed the others to conserve their light as they pressed forward. The corridor narrowed sharply, forcing them to walk in single file, and the air took on a sour, metallic taste. They began noticing faint markings on the floor, footprints, some booted, others bare. The bare ones disturbed them most. They were small, almost childlike, and fresh enough to stand out clearly in the dust that had lain undisturbed for 79 years. No one wanted to say it aloud, but they all saw it. Then came the whispers. At first it was just a soft rustling sound like wind through leaves, but there was no wind in the sealed tunnel. The sound grew clearer, layering itself into fragmented voices speaking in tones too low to discern the language. It seemed to come from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere at once. Lucas turned his remaining flashlight toward the source, and the beam caught movement, a flicker of a shadow darting across the far end of the tunnel. They all froze, their instincts caught between curiosity and terror. When the shadow reappeared, it was closer, moving not as something alive, but as something projected, a distortion of darkness with no defined form. The temperature dropped further, frost beginning to form on their breath, and Anton's flashlight began flickering rapidly before shutting off completely. In the brief strobing light, he saw what looked like faces, pale, hollow, pressed against the walls from within, as though trapped behind the concrete. He stumbled back, shouting for the others to look, but when their lights turned, the walls were smooth again. Yet the smell of damp earth and rot filled the air, a suffocating reminder that they were surrounded by something ancient and buried. Dr. Vogt tried to maintain control, insisting that panic would endanger them all, but even her voice wavered when they heard a faint tapping sound behind them, slow and deliberate. It was not mechanical, it was rhythmic, like knuckles knocking against metal. The tapping came closer, then stopped. In the silence that followed, Lucas whispered that the tapping had been mimicking their earlier walking pattern. Nobody responded. They simply kept moving forward, guided by the single remaining flashlight beam and the compulsion to reach the heart of the structure. At the end of the tunnel, they entered a circular chamber that none of their schematics had predicted. The room was lined with corroded steel panels and a single large circular emblem carved into the floor. Around the emblem were black stains that resembled burns, though there was no sign of fire damage elsewhere. The strange humming grew loudest here, resonating from beneath the floor, a deep frequency that made their bones ache. The group spread out cautiously, examining the walls. In one corner, they found old equipment, broken speakers, thick cables, and a control console covered in dust. The switches were still intact, though fused with age. When Anton brushed the dust away, the hum momentarily spiked, vibrating the entire room. The group fell silent, straining to hear beneath the hum, and that was when they realized the sound wasn't uniform, it was layered. Beneath the mechanical rhythm there were voices again, whispering in unison, forming patterns like chanting. The language was incomprehensible, but it carried a cadence that felt ritualistic, almost liturgical. The lights dimmed slightly, and the shadows on the wall stretched upward, forming shapes that seemed to twist and merge as if alive. Lucas raised his camera instinctively, though the lens refused to focus. Every frame he captured warped and melted into streaks of grey and red, the figures indistinct but undeniably human in outline. Anton began muttering prayers under his breath, while Dr. Vogt whispered hurriedly that they needed to retreat. But before they could, the hum shifted again, deeper now, resonating through the floor, vibrating their teeth. One of the walls groaned as if straining under pressure, and from a crack near its base, a stream of air hissed out, cold, moist, and foul-smelling, carrying with it a faint sound like distant breathing. They stood frozen in place, unable to tell whether the sound came from the wall or from something beyond it. It was then that Lucas's dying flashlight flickered one last time, illuminating the far side of the chamber, where the outline of a doorway was faintly visible beneath the corroded steel, sealed by heavy bolts and engraved with the same spiral symbol they had seen before. The team stared in silence, realization dawning slowly that the whispers, the temperature drops, the distortions, all of it seemed to be emanating from behind that door, a door that none of them had any intention of opening. They stood before that sealed steel door for what felt like hours, the whispering hum rising and falling like a living heartbeat, and though none of them spoke it aloud, every person in that chamber knew that what lay beyond it had not seen light since the final hours of the war. The markings carved across the metal were precise and deliberate, their shapes resembling a fusion of scientific diagrams and occult sigils. Every line connected to another, every circle intersected by a spiral that seemed to twist inward toward an unseen center. The strange symbol engraved across the door matched the ones they had seen in the documents and artifacts above, the same one labeled in those frantic notes as the gate. The air around it was colder than anywhere else in the bunker, so cold that frost began to form on the hinges and their breaths turned into a thick mist. Dr. Vogt tried to focus on the practical explanation, muttering that it might be a temperature anomaly caused by trapped gases, but her words carried no conviction. Anton shone his light across the surface of the door and discovered several inscriptions etched into the steel. Some were in German, others in Latin. One phrase translated roughly to, "He who awakens the silence shall inherit the void." Another appeared to be a warning signed with initials, letters carved deeply, tremblingly, almost as if whoever wrote them had done so in fear. The bolts themselves were enormous, industrial mechanisms that would have required heavy tools to remove, yet one at the bottom looked slightly loosened as though someone had tried to open it before and failed. The realization unsettled everyone. If someone had tried to open it from the inside, it meant that whatever was beyond that barrier was never meant to leave. Lucas set his camera back up despite the repeated malfunctions. The lens flickered, distorting the image in rhythmic pulses that seemed to match the humming sound. He whispered to the group that the static was not random. It appeared to form patterns, almost like signals. His voice trembled as he replayed the footage in slow motion, revealing flashes of light patterns, repetitions that resembled Morse code, except no one could decode the sequence. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, the image on the screen appeared to show movement behind the steel, a vague outline that shifted like something alive in the darkness. Ignoring the growing panic among the team, Dr. Vogt decided they had to document the chamber thoroughly before alerting the authorities. She began dictating notes aloud, describing the markings, the structure, the unnatural coldness. Her breath quivered in the freezing air, each word clouding in front of her face. Anton began taking photographs while another technician used a handheld sensor to measure radiation and magnetic fields. The readings were chaotic, spiking 1 second, dropping to 0 the next. When the device passed near the base of the door, it began to emit a high-pitched tone that wouldn't stop until it was switched off completely. The more time they spent near the door, the more the environment began to change. The air thickened, their ears rang, and the faint hum turned into something closer to a drone, a low resonance that vibrated deep in their skulls. Lucas said it felt like standing too close to an industrial generator, except there was no power source anywhere in the bunker. The sound seemed to emanate from beneath their feet, from within the walls, and worst of all, from behind the sealed steel barrier. The shadows thrown by their flashlights began to stretch unnaturally, bending along the curves of the room, moving in ways that didn't correspond to their movements. Anton swore under his breath that he saw one of the shadows flick its head toward him, its shape distorted but human enough to make him stumble back in terror. Dr. Vogt attempted to stabilize the group's nerves by ordering them to retreat to the previous chamber for air, but before they could move, the lights dimmed. Lucas's camera caught the moment clearly. The bulbs above them flickered 3 times, the hum deepened into a subsonic pulse, and a faint vibration rippled through the floor. Then came a sound that silenced everyone, the distinct metallic groan of something shifting inside the sealed door. The bolts rattled as though under pressure, and a fine dust fell from the ceiling. Someone gasped, another prayed, but none of them dared run. They were frozen, staring at the door, waiting to see if it would move again. After a few tense seconds, the vibration stopped, and silence returned, heavier and thicker than before. Anton approached cautiously and pressed his ear to the steel. His expression changed instantly, his eyes wide and unblinking. When Dr. Vogt demanded to know what he heard, his voice cracked as he said he thought he heard breathing. Not the echoes of wind or vibration, but rhythmic human breathing. Slow, steady, and deep, like something asleep on the other side. The others dismissed it at first, convincing themselves it was stress or an echo of their own breaths. But when Lucas placed his camera microphone against the door and played it back, the recording captured a faint, undeniable sound. Inhalation and exhalation. Distorted, but unmistakable. Panic spread through the group. One of the younger members began to cry, insisting they should leave immediately, but Dr. Vogt's obsession overrode her fear. She whispered that history itself was behind that door, that whatever had been buried there was the key to understanding Hitler's final days. The records they had uncovered, the references to resurrection, the diagrams, they all pointed to something more than superstition. She believed they had found proof of the regime's attempts to breach the limits of mortality, to summon or preserve something beyond human comprehension. Her voice trembled with both awe and terror as she theorized that the bunker was not just a shelter, but a containment chamber, and that what was sealed inside was never meant to decay. The hum grew louder still, vibrating in their bones now. The steel door began to frost over completely, tiny crystals forming intricate patterns that resembled veins or roots. Lucas's flashlight beam caught something glinting within the frost, a faint shape pressing outward from behind the door, as though a hand were pushing gently against the metal from the other side. He screamed and stumbled backward, dropping his light, which rolled across the floor and cast long, distorted shadows along the walls. For a brief instant, everyone saw what he had seen. A faint impression, unmistakably human, pressing against the cold steel, leaving a perfect outline of fingers before fading back into the dark. Dr. Vogt's breathing grew shallow as she realized the implications of what they had uncovered. The relics, the inscriptions, the notes about the ascension, the warning not to open the door, all of it pointed to one terrible conclusion. The bunker had been built not only to protect its occupants from the outside world, but to imprison something within, something that had waited in silence for 79 years, undisturbed, unseen, yet somehow still aware of the world above. The whispers in the air thickened, rising to a faint rhythmic chant that none of them could decipher, but all could feel vibrating in their chests, like a heartbeat calling from the other side. The team was no longer a group of explorers, but captives of the very place they had unearthed, each of them held under the weight of the unseen presence behind that frozen door. The hum had become a constant vibration in their bones, a frequency that seemed to bypass the ear and crawl straight into the mind. Lucas tried to turn off his camera, but the lens refused to shut. It kept recording, the red light pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark. Every few seconds the feed glitched, the screen filling with static and faint silhouettes that seemed to shift behind the team, moving when no one moved. Anton muttered prayers that dissolved into trembling whispers, his voice cracking each time the hum deepened. Dr. Vogt stood near the steel door, staring at the frost patterns with a look that blended terror and fascination, her lips moving as if reading words invisible to everyone else. The temperature continued to fall, their breaths now thick enough to cloud their vision. The concrete walls creaked like something settling, or something waking. From deep within the steel, faint sounds began to emerge again. Rhythmic tapping, the scrape of metal against metal, the hiss of air that should not have existed in a sealed structure. The team's instruments registered no rational explanation. The air pressure was constant. There was no airflow, yet the sound persisted, deliberate and patterned. Lucas's camera picked up the noise as well, but when they replayed the footage, the audio carried something else layered beneath it. A low murmur, almost a voice, whispering in fragmented German phrases. When slowed down, one word stood out, repeated over and over: "Weiter, continue." The whispering spread, no longer confined to the door. It slithered across the room, echoing faintly through the concrete, weaving itself into the hum until the two became inseparable. Anton suddenly dropped to his knees, clutching his ears and screaming that the sound was inside his head. The others rushed to help him, but he pushed them away, pointing at the frost-covered wall and insisting that there were faces watching from within. Lucas swung his light toward the wall, and for a fraction of a second, they all saw it. Shapes forming beneath the frost, faint outlines of human faces, eyes open, mouths twisted in silent cries. The frost melted the moment the light hit it, leaving the wall smooth and bare, but the sight left them paralyzed. Dr. Vogt whispered that they were standing inside a containment site designed for psychic resonance, repeating theories once proposed by the occult branch of the Third Reich. She recalled documents that mentioned an experiment meant to capture human consciousness through a process called transference, the preservation of the mind beyond death. She spoke faster now, her voice trembling as she explained that Hitler's most loyal occult scientists had believed the mind could be stored like energy, confined within physical structures. The bunker, she said, might not have been built merely to hide. It could have been constructed to imprison. The others begged her to stop talking, to leave, to seal the entrance again, but she didn't seem to hear them. Her eyes stayed fixed on the frozen steel, on the spiral symbol etched deep into its surface. The hum shifted again, transforming into something almost melodic, a pattern that rose and fell with eerie precision, as if responding to her voice. The symbols along the door began to glow faintly beneath the frost, their light a dull crimson that pulsed with each vibration. Lucas's camera feed went completely white for a moment, then cleared, showing streaks of light running along the walls like veins. The sensors the team had placed earlier began to emit static-laced readings, their screens filling with meaningless data and numbers that changed too quickly to comprehend. Anton began to back away, shouting that they needed to shut everything down, but his voice was swallowed by the resonance filling the chamber. The metallic door trembled, not violently, but enough to make the bolts rattle in their sockets. Dust rained from the ceiling. Lucas stumbled backward, the camera trembling in his hands, catching brief flashes of the room, the steel, the frost, the faces of his companions all pale and rigid with horror. Then the sound came again, louder, unmistakable this time. A long, drawn-out exhalation from the other side of the door. It was not mechanical. It was not a recording. It was a breath, a living breath, deep and slow, the kind that carries weight and awareness. Dr. Vogt stepped closer despite the others shouting for her to stop. She placed her palm against the metal, and instantly the frost receded beneath her touch, melting into a web of rivulets that revealed the full engraving beneath. The spiral symbol glowed brighter, and a faint warmth pulsed from within the steel, as though something on the other side was responding to her. She whispered something too low to hear, her breath fogging against the door, and in that moment the hum ceased. The silence that followed was total, so complete that their own heartbeats felt deafening. Then, without warning, the door gave a single, low groan. The bolts shifted, slowly, deliberately. The lowest one turned with a metallic shriek, loosening half a rotation before stopping. The team erupted into chaos. Anton ran for the exit, shouting that they had to leave, while Lucas tried to pull Dr. Vogt away. She resisted, her eyes unfocused, her expression blank as though entranced. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of rust and ozone, and a low vibration spread through the floor. The frost along the walls began to crack, thin fissures forming patterns that stretched upward like skeletal hands. The whispering returned, no longer distant, no longer faint. It filled the room, a chorus of overlapping voices speaking words too old to understand, their tones neither male nor female, only human in the most distorted sense. Lucas dropped the camera as he dragged Dr. Vogt toward the exit, but not before it captured one final image. The red recording light blinked as the steel door began to bulge outward just slightly, like something pressing gently from within. The bolts quivered. The spiral pulsed brighter, now a deep, angry crimson that bathed the chamber in its glow. The faces beneath the frost returned, clearer than before, eyes open and mouths moving as though joining in the chant. Anton's scream echoed through the hall, followed by a sound that was not an explosion but a single deafening pulse of pressure, shaking dust from the ceiling and snuffing out every light. When the survivors, those few who made it back to the surface, were finally pulled from the wreckage hours later, their accounts were incoherent, fragmented, and riddled with contradictions. Lucas was found clutching his camera, its lens shattered, the final recording corrupted except for a few seconds of distorted sound. The noise that played was a low hum, layered with faint breathing and a single phrase spoken in German, repeated 3 times before the tape cut into static. Investigators translated it simply as, "We are not finished." Everything from the lower levels of the bunker was sealed off again, the entrances welded shut, the site buried under tons of concrete. Officials declared it unstable, unfit for exploration, and classified the details of the discovery. But those who had descended into that place knew the truth, knew that something had been disturbed after 79 years of silence, something that was never meant to be found again,